Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that one of the most powerful governments on Earth just quietly pulled the plug on one of the most profitable software contracts in history. No drama, no press conference, no emergency boardroom meeting broadcast to the world. Just a calm, calculated decision that sent shockwaves through the technology industry. And yet somehow, most people outside of tech circles never even heard about it. That's exactly what happened in France. And here's what makes this story genuinely unlike anything we've seen before in the world of technology and government. The thing that defeated Microsoft wasn't a flashy new competitor. It wasn't Apple coming in with a sleek pitch deck and a promise of seamless integration. It wasn't some billion-dollar startup backed by Silicon Valley venture capital with a revolutionary new operating system. It was Linux, free software, code that has existed since 1991, all built by volunteers and developers scattered across the globe, available to anyone on Earth who wants to download it at absolutely zero cost. 2.5 million computers, 2.5 million machines that currently run Windows, 2.5 million licenses that generate hundreds of millions of euros for Microsoft every single year. Gone. Not renegotiated, not reduced, gone. But this story is about far more than money, and it's about far more than operating systems. At its core, this is a story about power, about what happens when a sovereign nation looks at one of the most valuable corporations ever to exist and decides that the arrangement they've had for decades is no longer acceptable. It's about control, about trust, about the question of who ultimately owns the digital infrastructure that modern governments run on. And it's about a decision that is already being watched in silence by governments on every continent, each one running the same calculations, each one asking the same uncomfortable question. So let's talk about what actually happened, why it happened, and why the ripple effects of this story are going to be felt for a very, very long time. France has officially announced a government-wide plan to migrate its entire digital infrastructure away from Microsoft Windows and onto a customized operating system built on Linux. And when I say government-wide, I want to be precise about the scale of what that actually means, because it is staggering when you sit with it. This is not one department running a pilot program. This is not a handful of tech-forward ministers deciding to experiment. This is every minister, every civil servant, every police officer, every tax authority official, every arm of the French state, every single one of them moving off Windows and onto Linux across 2.5 million machines simultaneously. Think about what that actually involves for a moment. 2.5 million computers, 2.5 million users who have spent years, in many cases entire careers, working within a familiar Windows environment. 2.5 million sets of files, workflows, institutional memories, and daily habits that have been built around one operating system. And now all of it needs to move to something fundamentally different. This is one of the most ambitious government technology transitions ever attempted anywhere in the world. And the fact that it has received so little mainstream coverage outside of the technology press is, if you think about it honestly, one of the most baffling parts of the entire story. To understand why France made this decision, you have to understand the three forces that pushed them here. Not one. Reason. Not a single tipping point. Three distinct and compounding reasons, each one serious on its own, and together forming an argument that Microsoft simply cannot rebut. The first reason is money, and the numbers involved are genuinely difficult to wrap your mind around. Every year, the French government pays licensing fees to run Windows across those 2.5 million machines. The exact total has not been made fully public, but even the most conservative estimates place the annual cost in the hundreds of millions of euros. Not once. Not a capital investment that you make, absorb, and move on from. Every single year, like clockwork, that invoice arrives. And every year, the French government pays it for the right to run software it does not own. On hardware, it does. Linux costs nothing. Not in the dramatic, too good to be true sense. It genuinely costs nothing. It is open source software, developed and maintained by a global community of contributors, licensed in a way that allows anyone to use it, modify it, and distribute it without paying a single cent to anyone. The moment France completes that is migration. That recurring annual cost disappears entirely, not shrinks, not gets renegotiated downward. Disappears every year, forever. When you frame it that way, the real question stops being, why is France doing this? And the real question becomes, why did it take this long? And the answer to that question gets us to reasons 2 and 3. The second reason is sovereignty, and this is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable for Microsoft. Not just commercially, but philosophically. Think carefully about what it actually means. When a national government runs its entire digital infrastructure on software it does not control, every time a government minister drafts a classified document, that document is being created inside software designed by a foreign corporation, operating under the laws of a foreign nation, and ultimately answerable to a foreign government. Every time a national security database is accessed, every time sensitive communications move through government systems, every time critical infrastructure is managed digitally, all of it is happening inside a black box that the French government has no legal right to open, inspect, or audit. France cannot look inside Windows and verify what it does. They cannot check whether the software is doing exactly what Microsoft says it does, nothing more and nothing less. They cannot confirm with certainty that no information is being transmitted, logged, or stored in ways they are not fully aware of. They have to take Microsoft's word for it. And for most people, in most contexts, trusting a reputable company at its word is entirely reasonable. But for a sovereign government managing national security infrastructure, classified communications, and systems that quite literally run a country, trust us is not an answer that can be accepted indefinitely. Linux changes this completely. Every single line of code in an open source operating system is publicly visible. There is no black box. There are no hidden processes, no background operations that cannot be examined, no functionality that exists outside the reach of scrutiny. If France wants to know at any moment exactly what its government computers are doing, it can know. The code is right there, readable, auditable, modifiable. That difference between operating inside a system you can fully inspect and operating inside one you cannot is not a technical footnote. It is the entire argument. The third reason is the one that Microsoft would genuinely prefer not to be discussed publicly, and it connects directly to something that has become one of the defining tensions of the digital age: data collection. France has explicitly cited Microsoft's data collection practices as a contributing factor in this decision. Microsoft refers to what it collects as telemetry, usage data, information gathered to improve the product and deliver a better experience. That is the corporate framing, and in fairness, there is some truth to it. The data is used to improve Windows. But the French government's characterization of what this means for government infrastructure is considerably less charitable and considerably more accurate. Windows, by default, continuously collects information about how it is being used and transmits that information back to Microsoft's servers. On a personal laptop or a home desktop, this is the kind of thing that most people find mildly irritating but ultimately shrug off. The trade-off feels manageable. But on 2.5 million government computers, processing sensitive national data, handling security communications, managing critical infrastructure, the calculation is entirely different. And here is the part that no enterprise agreement or privacy configuration can fully resolve. The data collection is baked into the core of the operating system itself. It is not a setting that can be cleanly switched off. It is not a feature that can be disabled with a simple toggle in a control panel. It is part of how Windows is built at a fundamental level, and what any government client can do is manage and limit it, not eliminate it entirely. France looked at that reality and concluded that managing an acceptable level of foreign data collection on its national infrastructure was not the same thing as controlling its national infrastructure. And they are right. Linux, by default, collects nothing. There is no telemetry sent anywhere unless an organization explicitly configures it to do so. No background processes quietly phoning home. No usage data flowing to servers outside the government's control. For a government that has decided that digital sovereignty is a genuine priority rather than a talking point, that difference is not merely preferable. It is decisive. Now, here is where this story takes a turn that even people who have been following it closely often miss, because France is not doing what most people imagine when they picture a large organization deciding to switch to Linux. They are not downloading a popular distribution, installing it on a few test machines, crossing their fingers, and hoping for the best. They have a foundation, a real, tested, battle-hardened foundation. And the origin of that foundation is one of the most unexpected and frankly delightful details in this entire story. The French National Police, the Gendarmerie, built their own Linux distribution years ago. They called it Genbuntu, and the reason they built it is something that deserves to be remembered, because it is one of the most perfectly motivated decisions in the history of enterprise software. They built it specifically to avoid having to upgrade from Windows XP to Windows Vista. Let that land for a moment. Windows Vista. The operating system that launched with security dialog boxes appearing every few seconds, fans spinning at full speed just to render the desktop, and a system overhead so heavy that it made the previous version of Windows look like a masterpiece by comparison. Vista was so comprehensively, historically bad that the French National Police looked at it, evaluated it seriously and professionally, and collectively decided that they would rather build their own operating system from scratch than install it. The Microsoft product that was supposed to be the future of Windows caused an entire national police force to defect to open source. The damage Vista did to Microsoft's credibility with government clients has never been fully tallied, but it pushed the Gendarmerie toward Linux and kept them there through every subsequent Windows release. and the distribution they built to escape Vista has been evolving ever since. Updated, refined, battle-tested across hundreds of thousands of machines, working through the practical problems of real-world deployment over more than a decade. That mature, proven platform is now the technical foundation for the entire French government's migration plan, something that began as institutional stubbornness, as a refusal to adopt a terrible operating system, has grown quietly and steadily into the infrastructure backbone of one of the most ambitious digital sovereignty initiatives any government has ever undertaken. There's something genuinely poetic about that. The Gendarmerie did not set out to change the course of French technology policy. They just did not want Vista. Now, in the interest of telling this story honestly, it would be wrong to discuss France's plan without talking about what could go wrong, because things could absolutely go wrong, and the history of government Linux migrations is not uniformly triumphant. Moving millions of people from a familiar operating environment to a different one is genuinely, practically difficult. These are people who have spent years, sometimes entire careers, navigating the same interface, the same file structures, the same applications. The day a migration goes live, they sit down in front of a computer that looks and behaves differently in ways both large and small. Familiar reference points have moved or disappeared. Tasks that previously took 30 seconds now require asking for help. Something as simple as printing, which should be straightforward, can become a project, because printer compatibility has been one of the most persistent real-world problems with Linux. Deployments for years. A driver that works perfectly on Windows may not exist in a usable form for Linux, or may exist only in an outdated version that requires more technical knowledge to implement than the average civil servant possesses. File format compatibility is another genuine concern. The French government has accumulated years of documents, spreadsheets, and presentations created in Microsoft Office formats. Opening them in Linux-based Office software is possible, and the open source alternatives have improved dramatically over the years. But possible and perfect are not the same thing. When a critical government document fails to render correctly on the morning it is urgently needed, the consequences are not just inconvenient, they are political. They become the kind of story that ends up in a newspaper and provides ammunition to everyone who said from the beginning that the migration was a mistake. These are exactly the problems that sank the Munich migration, which is probably the most cited cautionary tale in the history of government Linux adoption. Munich made a serious, well-funded, genuine effort to move its city government to Linux, encountered these kinds of problems at scale, and ultimately had to partially reverse course. It was a public and expensive outcome that became the standard argument against large-scale government Linux adoption for years afterward. France knows this history. What France has that Munich did not is a decade plus of real-world deployment experience through the Gendarmerie, an established technical team that has already solved many of these problems, and political will at the highest levels of government. Whether those advantages are sufficient to navigate the practical difficulties at this unprecedented scale, that remains the central open question. But here's the part of this story that goes well beyond France, well beyond Linux, and into something much larger and more consequential for the future of technology and government worldwide. France is not the only government thinking this way, not by a considerable distance. Germany has been actively pushing Linux in government environments for years. The Italian military runs Linux. Spain has its own government Linux distribution. Across Europe, there's a growing and increasingly serious movement around what officials have begun calling digital sovereignty. The idea that nations should control their own digital infrastructure rather than being dependent on foreign corporations for the software that runs their governments. The European Union has levied billions of euros in fines against Microsoft over the years for various competition and privacy violations. Governments across the continent have grown progressively more uncomfortable with the degree to which American technology companies have embedded themselves in critical national systems, and France's announcement is the most dramatic and visible expression of that discomfort to date. The geopolitical dimension of this should not be underestimated. When a government runs its critical infrastructure on software owned by a foreign corporation, it is not merely a technology choice. It is a dependency relationship with real geopolitical implications. The corporation's home country can, in principle, exert pressure. Changes in trade relationships, diplomatic tensions, sanctions, or simply shifts in corporate policy can have consequences for the government's ability to operate its own infrastructure. Digital sovereignty, framed this way, is not a technology discussion. It is a national security discussion. And the fact that France has chosen to frame it explicitly in those terms is a signal to every other government in the world. If France succeeds, and I want to be precise about that conditional because it genuinely matters, but if France succeeds, the implications extend far beyond the French government's IT budget. Every government in Europe, and many outside it, will be watching the results. They will see whether the migration is manageable. They will see whether the cost savings materialize as projected. They will see whether French civil servants adapt without the system collapsing. And if the answer to those questions is yes, the conversation in government IT departments across the world changes completely. For decades, Microsoft's most powerful argument for government clients has been inertia dressed up as prudence. The idea that switching away from Windows is simply too disruptive, too risky, too technically complex to be worth attempting. That Windows is the safe, stable default choice, and deviating from it is an adventure with unpredictable consequences. That argument, and the entire enterprise pricing strategy built on people believing it, gets directly challenged by the largest real-world test it has ever faced. Not a think tank paper, not a theoretical analysis, an actual government running actual operations on actual Linux infrastructure at actual scale. Microsoft, as of now, has said nothing publicly. No statement, no press release. No executive has addressed this on the record. And that silence, more than any response they could have crafted, communicates exactly how seriously this is being taken behind closed doors. There are really only a handful of moves available to them. They could compete on price, approach France with a dramatically reduced licensing offer, make the financial case for staying so compelling that the migration cost suddenly looks unjustifiable by comparison. But this move is also the most dangerous one available to them, because the moment you offer France a special deal, every other government that has been paying standard rates starts asking why. One negotiation becomes dozens of negotiations, and the entire architecture of Microsoft's government pricing is suddenly in play simultaneously across Europe and beyond. They could offer a customized product, a version of Windows with all telemetry disabled, full audit access, no data collection of any kind, stripped of every feature France objected to. A Windows built specifically to address every concern on the table. This has a certain surface logic to it, and Microsoft has built custom government editions in other contexts. But it runs directly into the problem France has already identified. It requires France to trust that Microsoft will deliver exactly what it promises, and to verify that trust without the ability to audit the underlying code. The entire point of this migration is that France has decided that level of trust is no longer something it is willing to extend. They could wait, say nothing publicly, calculate privately that the migration will encounter enough problems that it quietly collapses within 18 months, and let history do their work for them. The historical record gives them some reason to make this bet, but France has a functional foundation in Ubuntu that previous failed migrations never had, and the political will behind this initiative is not the kind that gets quietly abandoned. Or they can do what they appear to be doing, maintain complete public silence while running very serious internal calculations about what this means for their European government business, their global reputation, and the long-term argument they have been making for decades about Windows being the only practical choice for large organizations. When a company the size of Microsoft says nothing about something this significant, it is not because they have not noticed. It is because they have not yet decided what the right thing to say is. And that, in its own way, tells you everything. There is a broader lesson in all of this that goes well beyond the specifics of operating systems and licensing fees. What is happening in France is a signal, one of the clearest signals yet from a major government that the arrangement the technology industry has built its business model around for decades is under genuine scrutiny. That arrangement works like this. Governments and large organizations get hooked into a particular software ecosystem during its early, affordable days. Over time, as the ecosystem deepens, as files accumulate, as workflows get built around specific applications, as institutional knowledge becomes embedded in particular interfaces, switching costs grow enormous. The barrier to leaving is not the software itself, it is the disruption of leaving. And corporations like Microsoft have been extraordinarily effective at making that disruption feel prohibitively expensive, both in practical terms and in the psychological framing of what risky means. The risk of switching has always been front and center. The risk of staying, or the dependency, the data exposure, the loss of control, has always been minimized. France has looked at both sides of that calculation and decided the math has changed. The cost of staying, when you account for the money, the sovereignty concerns, and the data collection issues, is no longer obviously lower than the cost of leaving. And as technology has improved, as Linux has matured, as open source alternatives to Microsoft Office have become genuinely functional for most government use cases, the practical barrier to leaving has gotten lower, while the practical cost of staying has gotten higher. This is not a revolution that happened overnight. The seeds were planted in 2007 when a police force decided they would rather build their own operating system than install Vista. They were nurtured through more than a decade of quiet, unglamorous technical work, updating Ubuntu, solving printer compatibility problems, refining document workflows, training users, building institutional knowledge. The dramatic announcement France made is the visible tip of an iceberg that has been forming for years below the surface. And the question that governments around the world are now sitting with quietly, carefully, with their IT departments and their security advisors and their finance ministers in rooms that reporters are not in, is whether France's iceberg is about to become their iceberg too. 2.5 million French civil servants are about to discover what life looks like on the other side of this decision. Some of them will find it disorienting. Some workflows will break. Some mornings will be harder than they should be. That is the honest reality of any migration at this scale, and anyone who tells you otherwise is not being straight with you. But some of them, perhaps many of them, perhaps eventually most of them, will discover something unexpected. They will discover that Linux is not the alien, impenetrable territory it was once portrayed as, that the applications work. Well, that document's open. That the things they need to do, they can do. And if that experience accumulates across 2.5 million users, and the results are reported honestly back to the governments watching from a distance, the conversation about Windows as the inevitable, irreplaceable backbone of government computing will change in a way it has not changed before. Microsoft is not losing just 2.5 million licenses. Microsoft is potentially losing the narrative. And for a company whose entire government business model depends on people believing that Windows is the only practical, safe, reliable option for large organizations, losing the narrative might end up being more damaging than losing the revenue. The guillotine is not falling on anyone this time. It is falling on a Windows license. But it might just echo loud enough to be heard in every government building on the continent. The chapter being written right now in France has not reached its conclusion yet. Whether this becomes the model the rest of the world follows, or the cautionary tale that reinforces the status quo for another decade, depends entirely on execution. The technology is ready. The political will is there. The foundation has been built over 15 years of patient, methodical work by an institution that simply refused to install Vista. Now comes the hard part.